The most dangerous assumption is believing you know someone's worth before you know their name. The grand ballroom of Hamilton Hall glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across polished marble floors. Rows of elegantly dressed guests filled the room from front to back. Government officials, business leaders, educators, veterans, community representatives, and members of the press gathered for one of the most anticipated civic ceremonies of the year. Large video screens displayed the event logo behind a beautifully decorated stage. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while photographers moved carefully through the aisles searching for the perfect angle. The atmosphere carried a mixture of prestige, excitement, and expectation. Somewhere inside the building, one name remained hidden from nearly everyone in attendance. At the entrance leading toward the reserved seating area, Victoria Hayes walked calmly through the crowd. She wore a tailored navy blue suit and carried a simple envelope containing notes for a speech she hoped would inspire rather than impress. Her expression was composed. Her pace was unhurried. Unlike many guests around her, she seemed completely uninterested in attention. She simply wanted to reach her assigned seat before the ceremony began. As Victoria approached the front section of the ballroom, a uniformed officer stepped into her path. Officer Mark Reynolds stood tall near the entrance to the VIP seating area. He had spent the evening helping manage guest access and maintaining security throughout the event. His confidence was obvious. People listened when he spoke. Most moved immediately when he gave instructions. Mark glanced briefly at Victoria before looking toward the reserved seats behind her. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that quietly announces a judgment has already been made. "Ma'am," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, "I think you may be heading toward the wrong section." Victoria stopped. "I am looking for my assigned seat." Mark nodded toward the back of the ballroom. "The general seating area is over there." A few nearby guests turned to watch. Others slowed their conversations. Victoria remained calm. "I believe my seat is in this section." Mark chuckled softly. "Believe me, this area is reserved." The smile never left his face. Imagine walking into a room where nobody knows who you are. Imagine being judged before you have spoken more than a few words. Imagine feeling dozens of eyes turning toward you while someone publicly questions whether you belong. Victoria experienced all of that in a matter of seconds. Yet her expression did not change. She simply held the envelope in one hand and met Mark's gaze. "I understand the seating arrangement," she said politely. Mark crossed his arms. "Do you?" The question carried enough sarcasm to make several people nearby exchange uncomfortable looks. A photographer paused for a moment before lowering his camera. An elderly couple stopped speaking entirely. The atmosphere around the entrance began shifting. What had started as a routine interaction was becoming something else. Mark gestured again toward the back rows. "You would probably be more comfortable there." Victoria said nothing. Sometimes silence reveals more than any argument ever could. Around them, the ballroom continued filling with guests. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes. Event staff moved between tables, making final preparations. On stage, technicians tested microphones one last time. Yet near the VIP section, attention was slowly gathering around a woman who remained calm, while a uniformed officer seemed increasingly certain that she did not belong where she stood. The uncomfortable silence near the VIP entrance continued to grow. What had begun as a brief exchange was now attracting attention from people who had no intention of becoming involved but could not stop watching. Conversations faded. Heads turned. The elegant atmosphere of Hamilton Hall remained intact, yet a small pocket of tension had formed around Victoria Hayes and Officer Mark Reynolds. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished surfaces while photographers adjusted their lenses nearby. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, event organizers finalized last-minute details before the ceremony officially began. Victoria remained exactly where she was. Calm, patient, composed. She held the envelope against her side and waited. Mark, however, appeared increasingly convinced that he was right. "You know," he said, glancing toward the reserved seating section, "these seats are usually assigned months in advance." Victoria nodded politely. "I am aware." Mark smiled again. "Then you understand why I am having trouble believing there has been a misunderstanding." Several guests exchanged uneasy looks. A woman standing nearby lowered her program and watched carefully. A photographer who had been preparing equipment suddenly found the interaction more interesting than the stage. Imagine standing in a room full of accomplished people while someone publicly questions whether you belong among them. Imagine knowing the truth, but realizing that no explanation will matter to someone who has already made a decision. Victoria understood exactly what that felt like. Yet she showed no anger, no frustration, no desire to argue. Her self-control seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. "Officer," she said gently, "perhaps there is another way to resolve this." Mark folded his arms. "I believe I already resolved it." He pointed once more toward the back section of the ballroom. "Those seats are available." The remark produced a few uncomfortable reactions from people close enough to hear it. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. The ceremony was less than 10 minutes away. Most people preferred avoiding conflict. Across the ballroom, large screens displayed images celebrating community leadership and civic achievement. Rows of distinguished guests continued arriving. Television cameras moved into position. Event staff checked name cards placed on reserved tables. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Yet one detail remained unnoticed by almost everyone in the room. Attached discreetly to Victoria's guest credential was a small gold insignia reserved for only a handful of individuals attending the ceremony. The marker was subtle, easy to miss. Mark had never looked closely enough to see it. Victoria had noticed his eyes briefly move toward her credential before returning elsewhere. He still had not examined it. He still had not asked for verification from event staff. Confidence had replaced curiosity. Nearby, a young event coordinator carrying a tablet hurried through the ballroom, reviewing seating assignments. As she passed the VIP entrance, her eyes briefly landed on Victoria. Something about the face seemed familiar. The coordinator slowed for half a second before being called away by another staff member. The moment passed. Victoria remained standing. Mark remained certain. The crowd remained silent. On stage, technicians completed a final microphone test. The sound echoed gently through Hamilton Hall. Guests began taking their seats. The ceremony was drawing closer with every passing minute. And while hundreds of people prepared to celebrate an extraordinary honoree whose identity had not yet been publicly revealed, that very person stood only a few feet away, quietly waiting while an officer who believed he understood the situation failed to recognize the most important guest in the building. The final minutes before the ceremony seemed to move both quickly and painfully slowly at the same time. Throughout Hamilton Hall, guests settled into their seats beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, while soft orchestral music played through hidden speakers. The atmosphere carried the weight of importance. This was not simply another public gathering. It was an evening dedicated to honoring extraordinary achievement, leadership, and service. Yet near the entrance to the reserved section, attention remained fixed on a very different scene. Victoria Hayes stood quietly with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. She neither argued nor retreated. Her composure seemed to confuse people almost as much as the situation itself. Officer Mark Reynolds remained convinced he was protecting the integrity of the event. The certainty in his posture never wavered. "I am trying to save you from an embarrassing situation," he said. "Once the ceremony starts, it will be much harder to correct a seating mistake." Victoria looked toward the stage where event staff were making final preparations. "I appreciate your concern," she replied, "but I am exactly where I need to be." Mark smiled again, though this time the smile appeared thinner. "That is what you believe." Several nearby guests exchanged glances. The conversation had continued long enough that people were beginning to wonder why such a simple issue had not already been resolved. Imagine watching someone remain respectful while being repeatedly doubted. Imagine seeing confidence mistaken for confusion simply because it does not arrive in the form others expect. That was what many people were witnessing without fully understanding it. Across the ballroom, the young event coordinator who had briefly noticed Victoria earlier stopped beside a registration table and opened a digital seating chart on her tablet. She scanned names, table assignments, and special guest designations. Suddenly, her eyes paused. A familiar name appeared near the very top of the list. Victoria Hayes. Next to it was a gold designation reserved for the evening's most important recognition. The coordinator frowned. She looked back toward the VIP entrance. Then she looked again at the screen. Her expression changed immediately. Meanwhile, on stage, technicians completed another microphone check. The sound echoed gently through the hall. Large screens displayed images celebrating community projects, scholarships, and civic leadership programs. Hundreds of guests watched with growing anticipation. The official start of the ceremony was now only minutes away. Back near the entrance, Mark continued speaking. You know, most people would simply admit they walked into the wrong area. Victoria met his gaze, and most people would verify the facts before reaching a conclusion. The response was delivered so calmly that it landed harder than any raised voice ever could. A few guests nearby lowered their eyes. Others looked away entirely. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the room. Then movement suddenly appeared from the far side of the ballroom. The young coordinator was walking quickly through the crowd, tablet in hand. Her pace grew faster with every step. She looked directly toward Victoria, directly toward Mark, and with each passing second, she seemed increasingly concerned. Victoria noticed her approach immediately. Mark did not. He remained focused on proving a point. But somewhere behind the stage curtain, organizers were already preparing an announcement that would soon reach every person in the room. And when that announcement arrived, the assumptions surrounding Victoria Hayes were about to collide with a truth powerful enough to silence an entire ballroom. The young coordinator reached the VIP entrance breathing slightly faster than before. The tablet in her hands remained open to the official seating chart, and the concern on her face immediately caught the attention of several nearby guests. For the first time that evening, someone appeared to be carrying information that might finally answer the question hanging in the air. Victoria Hayes noticed her approach, but remained perfectly composed. Officer Mark Reynolds turned as well, though his expression suggested he expected confirmation rather than contradiction. "Excuse me," the coordinator said politely. "I need to check something." Mark nodded confidently. "Perfect timing. Perhaps you can help explain the seating arrangement." The coordinator looked from Mark to Victoria and then back to the tablet. Her hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough for several observers to sense that something important was happening. Imagine standing in a crowded room where one small piece of information has the power to change every conversation taking place around you. Imagine watching certainty begin to crack because facts are finally catching up with assumptions. The coordinator cleared her throat. "Ma'am, may I see your credential?" Victoria handed it to her without hesitation. The coordinator examined the badge carefully. Her eyes immediately found the small gold insignia attached near the bottom. The moment she saw it, her posture changed. So did her expression. "Oh," she said quietly. Mark frowned. "What is it?" The coordinator looked up. "This credential is valid." A subtle murmur moved through the surrounding guests. Mark crossed his arms. "Valid for what?" The coordinator glanced at the tablet again, as if hoping the answer might somehow change. It did not. "Valid for the reserved section." Mark's confidence did not disappear immediately. Instead, it shifted into disbelief. "There must be a mistake." The coordinator shook her head. "There is no mistake." Around them, more people were beginning to pay attention. Conversation stopped entirely. Several photographers turned their lenses toward the growing scene. Across the ballroom, event staff hurried between tables making final preparations while the audience remained unaware that a completely different drama was unfolding near the front rows. Victoria accepted the credential back with a simple nod. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply remained gracious. The coordinator lowered her voice. "Ms. Hayes, I apologize for the delay." Mark noticed the formality immediately. "You know her?" The coordinator looked surprised by the question. "Of course." The answer landed heavily. Mark looked around and suddenly noticed that several other staff members were reacting in a similar way. Recognition, respect, familiarity, things he had failed to notice earlier. Yet even now, he still did not fully understand why. Then a voice echoed from backstage through a communication headset worn by an event manager nearby. "We are starting in 3 minutes. Is our honoree in position?" The manager immediately looked toward Victoria. The coordinator looked toward Victoria. Several staff members looked toward Victoria. One by one, heads began turning in the same direction. The atmosphere shifted. Something larger than a seating dispute was beginning to emerge. Up on stage, the master of ceremonies stepped toward the podium while technicians activated the giant display screens. Guests returned their attention toward the front of the ballroom. The event was about to begin. And as lights brightened across the stage and cameras moved into position, The announcement that would change everything drew closer with every passing second. The ballroom lights softened as the ceremony officially began. A gentle spotlight illuminated the stage while the master of ceremonies stepped behind the podium. Hundreds of guests settled into silence. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Camera operators adjusted their positions. Reporters prepared notebooks. The atmosphere shifted from social conversation to formal recognition. Yet near the front of the room, another kind of anticipation was building. Victoria Hayes remained standing calmly beside the reserved seating area, while Officer Mark Reynolds struggled to reconcile what he had just learned. The valid credential, the reactions from event staff, the repeated references to an unnamed honoree. Pieces of a puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the full picture still remained hidden. Imagine standing only a few feet away from the truth while remaining unable to see it. Imagine realizing that every assumption made earlier might have been built on incomplete information. That realization was slowly settling over Mark. On stage, the master of ceremonies welcomed the audience and thanked the distinguished guests for attending. Applause echoed throughout Hamilton Hall. Large screens displayed images celebrating years of community service, educational initiatives, charitable projects, and civic leadership. The evening was designed to honor people whose contributions had improved the lives of others. As the program continued, several awards were presented. Recipients walked onto the stage, accepted recognition, and returned to their seats. Everything unfolded smoothly. Yet backstage and among the organizers, one topic continued dominating quiet conversations. The final honoree, the most significant recognition of the evening. The name remained secret from most attendees. Near the VIP section, the young coordinator received another message through her headset. Her eyes widened slightly. She immediately looked toward Victoria again. This time her expression contained unmistakable respect. "Everything is ready," she said softly. Victoria nodded. "Thank you." Mark noticed the exchange. "Ready for what?" The coordinator hesitated. She seemed unsure whether she should answer. Before she could speak, another organizer approached quickly and handed Victoria a small wireless microphone. Several nearby guests immediately noticed. A ripple of curiosity moved through the surrounding tables. Why would someone receive a microphone unless she was expected to speak? Mark stared at the device in Victoria's hand. His certainty continued eroding. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies reached the final section of the program. His tone became more serious, more deliberate. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate a leader whose impact has transformed communities across this nation." The room fell completely silent. Every eye turned toward the stage. The giant screens behind the podium faded to black. Then a single image slowly appeared. Not everyone could see it immediately from their angle, but those nearest the front rows reacted first. Heads turned. Expressions changed. A murmur spread through the audience. The image filling the screens showed a familiar face. Victoria Hayes. The reaction moved through Hamilton Hall like a wave. People looked from the screens toward the woman standing near the VIP entrance. Conversation stopped. Even photographers lowered their cameras for a moment in surprise. The master of ceremonies smiled. "Please join me in recognizing this year's highest civic honor recipient, Ms. Victoria Hayes." In that instant, the entire room seemed to pause, and the announcement that had been waiting all evening finally changed everything. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The image of Victoria Hayes remained on the giant screens towering above the stage, while the words of the master of ceremonies seemed to echo through every corner of Hamilton Hall. Guests who had spent the evening wondering who would receive the highest recognition now had their answer. Heads turned in unison toward the woman standing near the VIP entrance. The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause could have. Officer Mark Reynolds stood frozen. Moments earlier, he had been absolutely certain that Victoria did not belong in the reserved section. Now the entire ballroom was learning that she was not simply a guest. She was the very person the ceremony had been built around. Imagine standing in a crowded room and watching every assumption collapse at once. Imagine realizing that the person you questioned was the person everyone had gathered to celebrate. That realization settled over Mark with unmistakable force. Then the applause began. It started with a few people near the front rows. Then more joined. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Hundreds of guests stood and applauded as the screens displayed photographs of Victoria's work, community initiatives, educational programs, and years of public service. The standing ovation grew louder and louder until it filled the hall. Yet through it all, Victoria remained remarkably composed. She smiled politely, acknowledged the crowd, and thanked the coordinator who had handed her the microphone. There was no sign of triumph, no desire to embarrass anyone, only quiet grace. Event host Samuel Whitman quickly stepped down from the stage and approached her through the center aisle. His expression mixed admiration with concern. "Ms. Hayes," he said warmly, extending his hand. "We have all been waiting for you." Victoria shook his hand. "I am happy to be here." Samuel glanced briefly toward Mark and immediately understood more than he needed to. The atmosphere around the entrance told the story without requiring explanation. Several organizers had gathered nearby. Their expressions revealed a mixture of relief and discomfort. The evening's most honored guest had been standing only a few feet away from her designated seat, while confusion unfolded around her. Samuel turned back toward Victoria. "The stage is ready whenever you are." Another wave of applause swept through the room. Photographers raised cameras. Television crews adjusted their angles. Reporters hurried to capture notes. Across the ballroom, guests continued standing in respect. Victoria looked toward the stage and then toward the audience. For a brief moment, her eyes moved across the room and landed on Mark. He lowered his gaze almost immediately, not because anyone demanded it, because the truth now stood fully visible. Victoria offered the smallest nod before turning toward the aisle. It was not a gesture of victory. It was something far more powerful: understanding. As she began walking toward the stage, the crowd parted naturally to make room. Applause followed her every step. The giant screens continued displaying her accomplishments. But the most remarkable thing about the moment was not what appeared on the screens. It was the way she carried herself. Calm, humble, dignified. The ceremony had finally reached the announcement everyone would remember. Yet for many people in that ballroom, the most unforgettable lesson had already arrived before Victoria ever spoke a single word. Victoria Hayes stepped onto the stage as the standing ovation continued rolling through Hamilton Hall. The applause seemed endless, yet she carried herself as though she were simply another guest attending the ceremony. The giant screens displayed moments from her years of service, images of community centers, scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and countless projects that had changed lives across the country. Guests watched with admiration. Some nodded as they recognized accomplishments they had read about in newspapers and reports. Others appeared surprised that so much influence had come from someone who carried herself with such quiet humility. Imagine spending years building opportunities for others, and then discovering that the greatest measure of success is not recognition, but the people whose lives were improved because you showed up when nobody else did. That idea seemed woven into every image displayed behind her. Event host Samuel Whitman welcomed Victoria to center stage and presented the award before stepping aside. The audience applauded once more as she accepted the honor. Then the room gradually settled into silence. Hundreds of people waited for her remarks. Reporters prepared to record every word. Cameras focused on the stage. Even those seated near the back leaned forward slightly. Victoria approached the podium and placed her envelope on the surface before her. She looked across the audience without rushing. There was no sign of anger, no sign of resentment, only calm reflection. "Thank you," she began. Her voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. "This recognition means more than I can adequately express." The audience listened carefully. But tonight is not really about one person. Every achievement displayed behind me represents the work of teachers, volunteers, mentors, families, community leaders, and people who chose to help others even when nobody was watching. Heads nodded throughout the room. The message felt genuine because it was. Victoria never spoke as though she stood above anyone else. Instead, she spoke as someone who understood the value of collective effort. Meanwhile, near the entrance of the reserved section, Officer Mark Reynolds remained standing quietly. The ceremony continued around him, but his attention remained fixed on the woman at the podium. Earlier that evening, he had seen only what he expected to see. Now he was seeing what had been there all along. The difference troubled him more than he wanted to admit. On stage, Victoria paused briefly before continuing. "There is something else I would like to share." The room became even quieter. Over the years, I have learned that respect should never depend on titles, awards, positions, or public recognition. Every person deserves dignity long before anyone learns their accomplishments. The words drifted gently across the ballroom, yet their impact felt immediate. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Others lowered their eyes. Some reflected on moments from their own lives. Victoria was not speaking about a single incident. She was speaking about a principle, a truth, one that reached far beyond the walls of Hamilton Hall. The audience responded with sincere applause, not because the words were dramatic, because they were honest. And as the applause echoed once more through the ballroom, many people realized they would remember this speech long after they forgot the details of the ceremony itself. As the applause gradually faded, Victoria Hayes stepped away from the podium, but the impact of her words remained suspended in the air. The audience was no longer reacting simply to an award recipient. They were responding to a message that felt personal. Throughout Hamilton Hall, people sat quietly reflecting on what they had just heard. Some looked toward the stage. Others stared thoughtfully at the programs resting in their laps. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier in the evening, excitement and prestige had defined the room. Now reflection and perspective seemed to occupy every corner. Victoria returned to her seat near the front of the ballroom. Guests nearby greeted her warmly. Community leaders shook her hand. Educators thanked her for programs she had supported. Young scholarship recipients smiled as they introduced family members. Yet despite the attention, she treated every conversation with the same kindness and patience. No one received more importance than anyone else. Imagine carrying a reputation large enough to fill a room and still choosing to make every person feel seen. That quality explained more about Victoria's success than any award ever could. Across the ballroom, event host Samuel Whitman continued guiding the remainder of the evening's program. Additional acknowledgments were made. Sponsors were thanked. Community achievements were celebrated. Yet even as the ceremony moved forward, conversations repeatedly returned to Victoria's speech. People quoted her words to one another. Some discussed the idea that dignity should never depend upon status. Others reflected on moments in their own lives when assumptions had shaped their judgments. The lesson was spreading naturally through the room. Near the entrance of the reserved section, Officer Mark Reynolds remained unusually quiet. His duties continued, but his attention often drifted back toward the stage and the audience. Throughout his career, he had relied on quick assessments. Most of the time, they helped him perform his responsibilities effectively. Tonight, however, he had witnessed the danger of allowing certainty to replace understanding. The realization stayed with him, not because anyone demanded accountability, not because anyone embarrassed him publicly, but because the contrast between assumption and reality had become impossible to ignore. As the evening progressed, several guests approached Victoria to congratulate her. Among them were civic leaders, nonprofit directors, and local officials. Many spoke about projects she had inspired or partnerships she had helped create. Listening to those conversations revealed something remarkable. The stories were rarely about awards or recognition. They were about opportunities created for others. Scholarships funded. Neighborhood programs expanded. Mentorship initiatives launched. Lives improved. The accomplishments displayed on the screens represented real people whose futures had been changed through years of effort. Eventually, the ceremony entered its final segment. Soft music filled the ballroom once again. Guests began preparing for closing remarks and the reception that would follow. Yet the emotional center of the evening remained unchanged. The highest honor presented that night was important. The speech was memorable. The standing ovation was powerful. But the lesson carried even greater weight. Long before the audience learned who Victoria Hayes was, she deserved the same respect she received after the announcement. And as that understanding settled over Hamilton Hall, many people realized they had witnessed something more meaningful than an award ceremony. They had witnessed a reminder that character is often revealed long before credentials are ever announced. The ceremony concluded, but very few people seemed eager to leave. Clusters of guests remained throughout Hamilton Hall, continuing conversations that had begun during Victoria Hayes's speech. Beneath the glow of the chandeliers, community leaders exchanged ideas, educators shared stories, and families posed for photographs. The evening had started as a celebration of achievement, yet it was ending as something deeper. It had become a reminder, a lesson carried not by a headline or an award, but by the simple contrast between assumption and truth. Victoria moved through the reception area with the same quiet grace she had shown all evening. She greeted volunteers, thanked organizers, and spent time speaking with scholarship recipients who wanted to tell her about their goals for the future. Every conversation seemed to matter equally. Whether she was speaking to a prominent official or a student attending such an event for the first time, her attention never changed. Imagine having every reason to focus on your own accomplishment and instead choosing to focus on the people around you. That choice explained why so many people respected her long before they learned her name. Near the entrance of the ballroom, Officer Mark Reynolds remained standing for a moment after most guests had moved toward the reception area. The room looked different now, not because the decorations had changed, not because the lights were different. It looked different because his perspective had changed. Throughout the evening, he had replayed the events near the VIP section again and again. The valid credential, the confidence in Victoria's voice, the patience she had shown when challenged, the announcement, the standing ovation, the speech. Each memory carried a lesson he could not ignore. Eventually, he noticed Victoria preparing to leave the reception area. Before she reached the exit, he walked forward. His expression held none of the certainty that had defined their first interaction. "Ms. Hayes," he said respectfully. Victoria stopped and turned toward him. "Officer Reynolds." For a brief moment, neither spoke. The noise of the reception seemed distant. Finally, Mark nodded. "I should have taken more time to understand the situation before making assumptions." The words were simple, honest. Victoria studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. Understanding usually begins when people are willing to listen. Mark nodded slowly. There was no argument, no public embarrassment, no dramatic confrontation, only a lesson acknowledged. Somehow, that made the moment more powerful. Victoria extended her hand. Mark shook it. Then she continued toward the exit. Outside, the evening air felt cool and calm. The city lights reflected across nearby windows while guests slowly departed into the night. Behind her, Hamilton Hall remained illuminated against the dark sky. The ceremony would be remembered for honoring an extraordinary leader. But for many who attended, another memory would endure far longer. They would remember the woman who remained dignified when doubted. They would remember the announcement that revealed the truth. And they would remember that respect should never arrive after recognition. It should come first, because a person's value does not begin when the room learns their name. Their value was already there all along. He believed the announcement changed everything. But the truth was that the announcement changed nothing about who she was. It only revealed what had been there from the very beginning.